Nikki, are you a sweet, savory, sweet person? Are you a savory, sweet person? What's your brunch?
I'm mostly a savory person for brunch.
Really?
I love eggs Benedict. That's like my
Oh
favorite
yeah.
brunch
Yum.
meal in the world.
Yum.
Sweet things in the morning kind of make me lethargic the rest of the day.
Right.
And
That's true. But I do love some French toast. Telling
I
you.
my philosophy has always been end with at least I lean savory, but you got to end with one bite of sweet. So if you can like sit
that's
next to
fair.
Yes.
someone
Okay.
who ordered
Yeah.
something sweet and then steal a little nibble at
Yes.
the end.
I think they might have a little like pastry thing.
Okay, well let's get you to brunch. Three, two, one. Hello and welcome to This Day, a history podcast from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. And welcome to our Some Sunday Context series. These are conversations we're doing on the weekends that try and offer a little historical perspective for the first year of the second Trump administration. And this today is Sunday Context 100 Days edition. First off, shout out to everyone who is watching on YouTube. Folks, go ahead and subscribe there. We're doing lots more video, especially for these Sunday chats. And happy Sunday to, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there. Happy Sunday.
Hello, Jody. Happy Sunday.
Hey there. Happy Sunday.
Let's cut right to it because I don't know. Let's move with the speed of the Donald Trump administration. Let's
Wait, is
see.
this going to take 100 days to
I
Yeah.
know.
record?
I
No, it is
know.
certainly not. But look, we are approaching 100 days of Donald Trump's second term. It is head spinning. It's moving in a million directions. I want to ask you, of course, what you two think of these first 100 days and maybe what from these first 100 days will be actually remembered in, I don't know, 100 years or so. But
Mm,
first, before we dive into Trump world, I do want to get some historical context. I think that will really help us evaluate these first 100 days.
yeah.
So let's start by asking, where did this idea for 100 days come from? And what other presidents get credit for the most intense and impactful 100 days? And I will just say the answer to both those questions might be the same person, right? It was sort of invented as a concept to try and capture how head spinning the first 100 days of Roosevelt were, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, he comes into office in the middle of this enormous national crisis. There has been, over the course of the many months between the election and his inauguration, this sense among Americans that we just want someone to do something,
Yeah.
like, please fix
Hmm.
things. And he comes in and he sees that as a kind of mandate. And so he calls into a special session Congress. And that special session of Congress lasts 100 days. And in those 100 days, he puts together the sort of skeletal infrastructure of the New Deal.
Yeah. Yeah. And is cranking out, cranking out jobs, cranking out new organizations, cranking out the alphabet soup that become all of these different sort of coalitions to help get Americans back on their feet. I mean, he feels as though he really does have a mandate because Hoover did nothing, or very little, we should say.
Yeah.
And so he has to sort of come in guns blazing.
Yeah, and stabilizes the banking system because that was
Yes.
the other thing.
Yes.
Like the
Yes.
banking system was like days away from completely collapsing.
Yeah.
And he, as soon as he like swear in, okay, run over to the
Yeah.
Congress, get
Yeah.
the Emergency Banking Act, and have this bank holiday, get the ship righted in that very emergency situation.
Yeah. And we've done an episode, I think, on the bank holiday
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
the context around that. I want to plant a couple seeds and then return to FDR and the FDR Trump comparisons that you hear
Mm.
some Trump people say. We'll return to that in a few minutes. But the other component here, which is very big, is also the media strategy that FDR took on, right? So he's
Hmm.
going to Congress, we'll talk about this, and asking for a lot of leeway. But then he is also going directly to the American people in these famous fireside chats and making the case, particularly around the importance of saving the banking sector. But then as he rolls out the New Deal, there's 15 major pieces of legislation in the first 100 days to get the New Deal going. But at every step of the way, he's sort of wrangling Congress and talking directly to Americans. And so just keep that in mind, the kind of
Yeah.
media strategy and the legislative strategy.
I would say what he's doing simultaneously is actually creating a new template of understanding of
Yeah.
how the public has expectations for the federal government.
Yeah.
Because Hoover was very much hands off, kind of like, whatever, kick rocks, people. And when FDR comes in, I think people start to have the expectation of seeing the government as father, as seeing the government as provider, as protector, as the person who is supposed to intervene when things are difficult. And so that people start to look to the federal government more and more as this, as really a safe haven in times of crisis.
And moreover, I think they look to this idea of like capital and, how big do you go, how early is sort of the expectation in some ways, and maybe an unfair expectation or a sort of skewing expectation that FDR sets, certainly not to diminish the fact that there were real emergencies that he needed to address. One last thing, a kind of rabbit hole that I saw but didn't decide to jump down in thinking about this is there's a little bit of like, I would say, conspiratorial thinking about how much FDR could have helped Hoover in the like window between election and inauguration, and whether FDR kind of negged Hoover a little bit in order to then have this moment where he rolls in and goes big. I don't think that's exactly right, but that is an interesting provocation of like, well, if it's truly an emergency and you truly have a plan, maybe you should have gotten in there and rolled up your sleeves a little earlier and tried to work with Hoover. But I don't know if Hoover would have been into that. Whatever. Anyway, like I said,
I will put the asterisk, which is that Hoover did not want to act without Roosevelt.
Right.
And so, like, he was president and he just wouldn't act. So it creates quite a contrast. But that is a fun rabbit hole to go down.
So maybe we'll do something on that. Okay. Let's go through some other presidents who might have a claim to the crown of most impactful first 100 days, or at least in various angles. I guess we got to start with Washington because, his first 100 days were the first 100 days of the presidency.
Fine. You got to hand it to George Washington.
Got to hand it to George Washington. Okay. I think the other one who has potentially a claim to say the first 100 days here were even more impactful than FDR's is Lincoln. So someone want to take the lead on running through all the things that happened to Abraham Lincoln in the first 100 days?
No question on Lincoln. I mean, my goodness, he gets into office and we're at war. Like there's hardly any time to sort of get his grasp around, like curtain design before he can has to decide like what he's going to do and how he's going to enlist soldiers. We just did a whole, episode about enlisting additional soldiers for the war effort. But he's got all of these generals as well who have different ideas about, how the war should take place. He's got this one general, Winfield Scott, who's like, you should just surrender. And it's like, what? Like, we haven't even gotten started, buddy. But people had all of these different ideas about what the war was going to look like, how long was it going to take, how serious is the South. I really think it's not until Virginia secedes about a month later, because that's right on D.C.'s front lawn, that they're like, this is actually going to be a lot bigger and a lot more protracted than I think it is, than we suspected. And so there's all of these, rushes to get troops who are out in Mississippi, actually west of the Mississippi, back to D.C. and to all of these other places to defend these, Confederate blockades and ports. It's quite the crisis very early on. And it really doesn't stop.
Yeah, and it's a real test of presidential power right from the beginning, because he's once he's in it, it takes him just a second to get his head around this war and get his cabinet on the same page. He's ordering blockades. He's suspending habeas corpus. I mean, that we talk about that sometimes in relation to the Civil War, but that happens almost immediately because of this
40,
wartime state. Yeah. And that I think will have some resonances. But this idea that he's testing the limits of presidential power because the nation is at war with itself.
Yeah.
I mean, literally day one is when he receives a letter basically saying, hey, Fort Sumter's about to fall. And, help us out. And then it's a week or two later that it does. And everything goes into crisis. The one other thing I will add is that obviously it's exacerbated by the looming war, but his internal sort of management is also fraying, right? And I mean, I think the classic team of rivals thing is in place. He has surrounded himself with people who are going to, say their piece, but he's also just having to wrangle a bunch of people who have different ideas, as you said, Kelly. And, he's clashing with William Seward. And Seward has different opinions about the war, but also is accusing Lincoln of getting kind of distracted by doing a lot of the sort of work that has to happen when a new administration comes up. So Lincoln, for instance, insisted on interviewing every single possible appointee in person. There's these stories about people lined up outside the Oval Office, and the line extends all the way down the hall and up to the second floor of the White House, and they're just sitting around waiting to get a meeting with Lincoln so that things can just move forward. And then at the same time, of course, he's dealing with the war. So,
it's like, delegate, buddy, delegate.
Exactly.
Right. I realized that the term micromanaging hadn't been coined
I
yet,
know.
but
Yeah.
let's
But another
focus
thing
on
to
what
kind of
matters.
like drop a pin on and think about as we sort of live through this moment is that you're also managing a big organization. You have a lot of just sort of like management decisions to make in addition to all the kind of policy and reacting to the rest of the world. And sometimes you can get really bogged down in that, especially if you are not surrounded by people who are competent or agree with you or will try and undermine you. So
Can I say what's really sad about Lincoln's presidency is that like the whole time essentially he's at war, and then finally when there's peace, he's assassinated. I mean, he doesn't eat. There's like not a single day where he gets a break.
yeah. We have touched on the whole, like, could Lincoln have prevented the war in this first little window question? We could probably do a whole full episode on that. But like, given how fast things are moving in these first 100 days, Kelly, does it make you kind of just like think about things in a different context?
Yeah, a little. I mean, I don't think he could have done anything to prevent the war. I think, if anything, his presidency sort of exacerbated war or brought it on faster. But I don't know. It's hard because historians don't like to say that anything is inevitable. You know what I mean? Like, we don't want to say, well, of course the Civil War would have happened, because we don't necessarily know that. But there are those sort of what ifs out there.
Yeah. Who's next?
I think we have to move into the Cold War era. I mean, the thing about the 100 Days conceit, you can tell the people we plucked from the 18th and 19th century was one guy because he was first and the other guy because the nation was at war. But like most of the time, members of Congress or members of the cabinet hadn't even gotten to Washington by the time the first 100 days is over. Like, it's a very slow moving kind of process. But, once you get into the 20th century, with this vision of a much more active, agenda-driven president, a much more active Congress, a world that could blow up at any minute, then things get a little spicy even in the first 100 days. I mean, JFK was dealing with the Bay of Pigs in the first 100 days, which was this kind of inherited but very poorly run attempt to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. It did not go well.
No.
Yeah, well, and I think the sort of interesting thing there, Bay of Pigs happens 87 days in. You look at the polling. I mean, it was certainly a misstep, a huge bungle on the part of the U.S., but he still kind of emerges from those 100 days with the feeling of action. And maybe Americans did see a little bit of like, well, you kind of inherited a little bit of this crisis, but also he did other things like he established the Peace Corps in the first 100 days. I mean, talk about a huge legacy. And that's part of the big question I think we're asking here is like, how much of your legacy actually is defined in those first 100 days? And then
my sister did the Peace Corps.
Yeah. Also in JFK's first 100 days, the Soviets launched the first human into space. And so, that clearly just starting gun to the space race. And so, very eventful. Let's rip through a few others, and then I do want to get to Donald Trump. Ford, we've done an episode on how Ford pardoned Nixon within a first month of taking office. That was widely condemned, but also kind of felt to Ford like a really critical moment to probably move past and get to his agenda, and instead it kind of like put him in quicksand a little bit.
Yeah. His approval ratings go into the basement immediately. Americans wanted a chance for accountability, and they didn't get it. Reagan also had a very eventful first 100 days. He was shot.
Yes.
You'll remember
69 days in. 69 days in.
But also on day one, he announces the release of the Iranian hostages, which was, engineered to happen on day one. He clearly had an eye towards, this window and coming in with a splash. And so that happens. Obviously, a lot of what we're talking about here are moments of crisis and how you respond. And often the crisis defines the first 100 days. So Obama's first 100 days are obviously defined by passing TARP, passing the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. That's 29 days in the middle of the financial meltdown. He is, to what we were talking about earlier about the period between election and inauguration. I feel like Obama's 100 days actually started 30 days earlier because if people remember, after the election in the winter of 2008, he really started just kind of like acting like I'm in charge now. Here's what we're going to do. I remember even, I think I mentioned this on the show, but he would give press conferences and there was a seal and the seal said, what was it? Office of Acting or Future President?
Office of President-elect.
President-elect,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
But it was just kind of like, I'm the captain now kind of moment.
Yeah.
Everyone was so done with Bush by that
Right.
point in time,
Yes.
even Republicans, and it was just like let's move on. Let's move on
Yeah.
to the next guy.
That
Those
idea-
last 3 months are the least productive. I mean, we can do a whole episode on the least
lame ducks?
productive.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
lame
Yeah.
duck presidencies.
Yeah.
It's like
But-
people are pretty much packing up.
But I think
chilling.
Obama really kind of redefined the sort of president-elect. Again, because of an
Absolutely.
emergency. Maybe the asterisk here is that Obama's clock on when you start to count actually started a little earlier.
Yeah.
I like that. Okay. Truman, it's a little bit of a technicality. How do you count Truman? He takes over when FDR dies, but you have to mention Truman because a little over 100 days into his first term in office, he drops the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Obviously, like that was a sort of result of stuff that he had inherited, but when we're mentioning eventful things that happened in the first 100 days, it's pretty eventful.
I mean,
Bombs that he did not know about 117 days earlier.
Yo.
Yeah.
There are two things when I think of Truman that define his presidency, and it's dropping of the bombs and desegregating the armed forces.
Yeah.
There's like the two things that his claims to fame.
Yeah, for
Which,
sure.
One
more honorable mention here. William Henry Harrison. What happened in his first 100 days?
Kicked it.
He died.
Biggest event of his life.
Yes, I think that's right.
Just died, kick the bucket.
So on the list of notable things that have happened to presidents or presidents have done in the first 100 days, yes, William Henry Harrison died.
Made the first sentence of his obituary.
Yes,
Man.
that's true.
Not
an
even a
accomplishment.
solid season. You know what I mean?
I know. All right, any other tidbits about the first 100 days before we get our thoughts on Trump?
Well, we've broken down, our researcher, Jacob, has broken down some of the numbers of the first 100 days. And I wanted to zero in, and maybe this is a good bridge over to the Trump conversation. Most laws passed in the first 100 days, 76 by Franklin Roosevelt. You mentioned these 15 enormous pieces of legislation, but there was a constant churn going through the Congress. And then Jacob has listed that the fewest laws passed were by George W. Bush in his first 100 days, which were 7. But actually, in the first 100 days of Trump's second administration, only 5 pieces of legislation have been
Actual
signed into
legislation.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's remarkable.
That's interesting. That is remarkable.
It's interesting, and I think it's kind of the point of what I think the first 100 days of the Trump administration is about, which is a lot has been happening. If we're talking about the amount of churn in the first 100 days, it might feel similar to very active presidencies like FDR's, but that's not the story. The story is the consolidation of power in the executive. Congress is basically fallow at this point, and everything that is happening is coming out of the executive branch.
If we're throwing other stats out there, Trump's approval rating is, I think, lower than any other president's the first 100 days, other than the first time he was president. But, he's hovering around 42, 43, 44%. JFK had an 83% approval rating after 100 days, which, again, was after Bay of Pigs had happened and still kind of resilient to that.
It's very handsome.
Yeah, he's very handsome. There is that.
The charm, Riz.
Kelly, let me ask you a question about kind of now that we've run through some of this and started to talk about Trump. I mean, it feels so much like the first 100 days, the ones that we remember are the ones that are defined by big events and particularly the idea of like you are responding to emergencies.
A crisis,
right? Banking crisis for FDR and Obama, war, assassination attempts. How does that make you think about what we've just been through with Trump's first 100 days?
It's interesting because I was talking to somebody else about this, the idea of like manufacturing struggle, like making up these crises so that you can respond, so that you can be the hero, so that you can put on the cape and say, look what I did. And a lot of, I think, these executive orders come from this brew of like manufactured struggle. Like, oh, we've got to solve academia. Oh, we've got to solve, like these LGBTQ issues, like the tariffs and this and all that stuff. And, a lot of that is orchestrated, is very sort of circus
Right.
level. It is derived not from actual like the world is falling apart kind of chaos, with the exception of maybe Ukraine,
Yeah.
but for the most part, a lot
Where
of
that
these
where
events.
actually I would argue there isn't a sense of urgency on the
Yes,
Trump
yes,
administration, right?
yes.
There's more of a kind of like, let it play out kind of vibe.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, which is fascinating too. So, a lot of that I think we look at someone like Lincoln or we look at someone like JFK and we're like, wow, imminent danger is here, is
Yeah.
present. And there isn't that sort of the danger is social, it's political, and really it's vengeance.
Yeah.
Right. There's not an external crisis that he is responding to, in addition to this idea of like the manufactured crisis, which I think is right. I think that that was the case in his first campaign as well, right? That Mexican rapists and
Yep,
murderers were coming
yep,
across the border, that ISIS was such a threat to the homeland that you had to ban all Muslims from coming to the United
yep,
States,
yep.
right? These are manufactured crises that he's seized upon in his first 100 days in office. But actually, the nation does have a crisis. It's just that the crisis is
Well,
his
yes.
presidency and what
Yes.
he's doing,
Yeah,
Yeah.
right? Because
yeah,
we have now a financial crisis. We have now a crisis of masked people kidnapping people
Yeah.
off the streets,
yeah.
and a constitutional crisis and a crisis in the judiciary. Like we have all of these crises, but they have been created by the president
Hmm.
rather than them being something that he's
Yeah.
attempting to solve.
Even when you think about FDR, his mandate when he came in was to create jobs. We had massive unemployment. The
Yeah.
first thing Trump does is massive firings. I mean,
Yeah.
people are let go from the federal government in waves that we have really not seen before. And I think that is a completely different take. People expect you to come in and create jobs, not cut jobs. And
Yeah.
that's really what happens. That's really, to me, a market difference between FDR and Trump.
And it gets to, I think, one of the big questions that just rattles in my head, has been rattling in my head for the last 100 days, which is, who is this for? Who voted for
Mm.
this? Who actually kind of wanted what we're seeing to play out other than, the folks who wrote Project 2025? On this question of emergency and kind of what that buys you in the first 100 days, I will say that I think there is an understanding on the part of Trump that, again, it's manufactured, but that you do need that in order to then get people to go in to get in line, right? And
Mm.
so, declaring this Venezuelan gang a terrorist
Yeah.
organization, invoking war powers that have been invoked like 3 times in history to argue for deportations, it at least, I think, shows that they understand that in these moments, if you create an emergency, right?
Hmm.
He's not just acting completely with impunity without any sort of attempt at a justification, right?
Hmm.
That's not to give him any credit whatsoever, but
Yeah.
I also think that then is part of the reason that it has really just like checked Congress, because they're saying, well, he's telling us there's this emergency wartime, we're all of a sudden at war with this Venezuelan gang. Okay, well then let's give him a long leash.
Yeah, I mean, I think it speaks to where centralized power is situated in
Hmm.
US law and institutions. And I think it even takes us back to Lincoln's first 100 days, right? You have an actual existential emergency,
Right.
and Lincoln suspends parts of basic civil rights, right? With habeas corpus. He does this blockade that's probably not within his powers. And over the course of time, especially over the Cold War, you get the institutionalization of all of these emergency responses. That wartime creates these precedents for how power might be
Yes,
used.
yes, yes.
And even outside of wartime now, what we are seeing is a president using those powers, understanding that he cannot be checked because the Congress, which is run by Republicans, is not interested in checking him. And the courts are attempting to check him here and there, but they've also granted him absolute pretty broad immunity from criminal and civil
But
prosecution.
he still
So,
props up that idea of we're at war, right?
yep,
As
Yeah.
a
Oh,
pretext.
yeah.
absolutely.
So yeah. I want to do one little sidebar about Trump and FDR, because as I mentioned, there are some Trump defenders, especially when they talk about kind of how fast he's moving,
Hmm.
how big he's trying to go in the first 100 days. There are people who will say, Well, look at what FDR did. FDR came in and basically said, I'm in charge now. I'm going to bulldoze everyone and I'm going to just get my way. And that is a complete misreading of history.
Yeah.
And I think we
That
should
is
sort of
incorrect.
rebuke that. And so,
Yes.
you know, just to be clear, FDR bullied Congress, but in a way that worked within the division of powers. And so, for instance, he says in the first few days of his administration, he says, quote, I shall ask the Congress for one of the remaining instruments to meet the crisis, broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency, as great as the power that would be given to me if it were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. But that I shall ask Congress for these powers is the key thing, right? Trump has never used any of that language. And moreover, to return to what we said earlier, I think another thing that FDR did was create pressure by going directly to the American people through fireside chats, by encouraging direct action, and that put pressure on Congress. So, you know, it's one thing to wage a very aggressive pressure campaign, but I would argue in a weird way that almost reinforces the system, right? Rather than I'm going to operate completely outside of it.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I'm really glad that we're talking about this because this is my giant annoyance as we talk about the 100 days.
And you
is
hear
that,
this floating around in conservative
oh,
circles.
yeah.
the
Oh,
FDR thing.
absolutely. And this idea that, you know, Roosevelt was smashing through these systems, even with something like later on expanding the courts. The Roosevelt administration was very concerned that the courts were going to strike these new pieces of legislation, these new institutions down. But they knew that when they struck them down, they were going to be struck down, right? That they were going to follow those court orders. Expanding the court was an entirely constitutional and precedented idea. And when Congress won't go along with it, FDR drops it.
Yeah.
So you have FDR, yes, like trying to figure out where he might be able to exercise more power, but he's actually honoring the system that had been set up politically for quite some time. And what we're seeing with Trump is a kind of inverse of FDR, right? Manufacturing emergency instead of responding to one, using executive power instead of using the legislature and the balance of powers and the separation of powers. But I think just as importantly, using his position to destroy state capacity in a way that hurts people instead of building state capacity to help people. And that's why, like, I think that the process questions are interesting, the parallels are interesting, but there is a difference between good things and bad things. And so don't just compare FDR and Trump on the basis of numbers of executive orders.
No, I mean, their approach is completely antithetical. Like, one is literally trying to build something. Another one is trying to demolish it, to destroy it, to diminish it. Like, when I think about Trump's first 100 days, I think about how much you have seen a shrinkage in like federal funding, in jobs, and the rolling back of people's rights. Like, you know, democracies are meant to expand on people's rights, not to sort of contract or take away or let people know like, oh, you know, you might have it today, you might not tomorrow. Like, it's not just that he's picking on Democrats or that he's just picking on like the little guy. It feels across the board like if you are not a, you know, billionaire, then you are in danger. And it didn't. That was not at all what FDR was trying to do. He was actually trying to empower people that were most impoverished.
So you said it feels like, and I want to ask one question before I then ask you what from these first 100 days is going to be remembered in 100 years. But we got a great question from a listener. We put a little chat on our Substack and got some good questions. But a listener wrote in and said, you know, it feels like Trump has crossed, and it probably is the case, a Rubicon of some sort, right? He's reworked executive power. He's taken all these actions that are going to take a long time to unwind or even just sort of reckon with. But his question, and I think it's really instructive, is, you know, have there been other moments in the first 100 days that maybe, you know, when you list out the things that happen aren't as destructive or impactful, but still felt that way? Still, Americans felt like, oh my gosh, this person is pushing so hard. It is head spinning. And I'm curious what you make of that. You know, do you feel like people living through the first 100 days of Lincoln or the first 100 days of FDR felt the way that we feel now in some way? Like, oh my gosh.
Yes, with an asterisk. My asterisk is the media environment is so different in 1861 or in 1933 that even just keeping up with what's happening you don't have that same sense of just being like flooded every single day, 20 times a day with push notifications of some new horror that's happened or just some new event that's happened that you feel like you have to stay on top of. So I think that that makes it feel different. I do think I would also add, and I don't know if it's just the first 100 days, but there was in 1981 a real fear around what Reagan was going to do because he represented such a different philosophy
Hmm.
from what had been common in US presidents in the 20th century, particularly over the last 40 or 50 years. And he does do some pretty dramatic things. We've talked about the Patco strike, but you know his approach, these enormous tax cuts and cuts to programs and putting somebody like James Watt in charge of the EPA, who's somebody who was like wanted to open up conserved land to logging and things like that. Like people were terrified about what was happening because they thought that it was the end of the New Deal state. And so I think that that's again like might not have had quite the same feel because even in
Mhm.
1981, it's not the same media
Yeah.
environment.
Yeah.
But it did, I think for some people, it felt like the wheels were coming off.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's interesting not just looking at how Americans have looked at the first 100 days, but how outside of
Mm.
the United States' perception has changed so much. When, like, I told you how I was in France a couple months ago and how, like, you know, they're like, oh, we have this new program to bring scholars here who are in danger of not being able to do their research. And I'm like, I can't imagine France is like, you know, telling Americans like it's not safe there. Come to France to do your research. And the idea of how people are thinking of America is, you know, maybe I don't want to go on vacation here. Maybe this isn't the place that is actually going to be welcoming and give me your tired or your week. You know, I don't think that America has will be able to maintain a reputation as being this sort of like
Yeah.
city on a hill, especially when you see how it's treating its own citizens, not just foreigners, but citizens.
Yeah.
And that to me is a huge, you know, the fact that like we didn't mention this, but Obama in his first 90 days, he visits 9 different countries.
Countries. Yeah.
And he's sort of going on this like world tour, you know.
Apology tour, as the Republicans like to
Yeah,
call it. But
yeah.
yes.
Trump doesn't go to any
No.
countries. And if we talk
But
about the encounter with Zelensky, like that had people like
yeah.
clutching their pearls in the way
Yeah.
that the world is looking at how Trump treats its other leaders,
But
leaders that are supposed to be allies.
to your point, though, I'm so glad you brought up kind of how the other world sees it because it's kind of feels like part of what's new here is like the rest of the world is also living through our 100 days. You know, we've dragged
Yes.
everyone into
Yes.
it. And actually, Trevor Noah, who I work with, talks about this all the time. I mean, he's often in South Africa, he's often in Europe, but he's like, I've never in my life had a moment where no matter what country I'm in, what type of person I run into. He talked about the other day about how like he got pulled over by a cop in South Africa, and the cop just pulled him over not because he'd done anything wrong, was going to get him in trouble. He was just like, Trevor, what's going on with Trump? Like, tell me, like what's the deal? You know, it's like
Yeah.
it's on everyone's lips, no matter where you are and who
Yeah.
you are. But that does bring me back to this question that we got from the listener about the kind of feel. I totally
Mhm.
agree. The media environment is different. We feel flooded by this information in a way that we never have even 15 years ago.
Yeah.
But in those first 100 days of the Civil War, like when people got together for brunch, they probably talked about the Civil War, right? And in the first 100 days of FDR,
Yeah.
when they got to, and in the same way that now it feels like we can't have any conversation that doesn't turn to Trump within 30 seconds, right? And I do think there were
Yeah.
probably moments in American history where it kind of felt like that way. Maybe not the speed, maybe not the completely overwhelming, but this is the center of gravity. What our president is doing, what the administration is doing in the first 100 days is the center of gravity
But
in
there's
American life at this moment.
there's a difference between, I think, talking about the Civil War, talking about, oh, another state just seceded, and talking about the president himself. Like,
You
I
don't
don't
think people were like, what's Lincoln
necessarily.
up to? You don't think all the articles were like, what's Lincoln up to? What's his next move? Speculation about him. I
Maybe,
mean,
but
he's a central
not in
figure,
that,
no?
but not in the same way as like, snap, am I going to get conscripted? Snap, am I going to
Yeah.
have to go to war? Like in the same way that they're thinking about, like the conflict that they're having, the neighbor against neighbor, the brother against brother idea, I think is much more pervading than it is how much Lincoln would be impacting their lives.
Hmm.
And the same thing I think you might say for like FDR, people are worried about putting food on the table. They're worried about eating. They're worried about their jobs. They're thinking about FDR, talking about him. But I think they're more sort of concerned with the overwhelming social and economic circumstances around them. Um, I think about Trump, unfortunately, more than I should. Do you know what I mean? More like I feel like his role plays more of a part of like my psyche than I think about these other issues, because I think of him as the center of that, or as the cause or the reason for these issues. Does that make sense? I don't know.
No,
Yeah, because it forces you to think about his psychology all the time, right? Like these events are happening not because of all of this exogenous stuff, but these events are happening because whatever whim he felt that morning, right? If somebody buttered his toast wrong, might end up, pulling out of NATO. And
just to put a fine point on what you both just said, but it's like the conversations were, how is Lincoln or how is FDR responding to X, as opposed to what is Trump thinking and what is that, and then what is going to, it's reversing the equation, right? It doesn't start. It starts with the external events and the real events, and now it starts with the person, and then the real world is a knockoff of that. All right. In our final few minutes here, let's come to this big question. We're not in the prediction business, but I think it is instructive to kind of take half a step back at least and say, okay, so much has happened in these 100 days. I'm a believer, and maybe this is optimistic, but like that no matter how much happens, it's just inevitable that some of the stuff is going to get sorted to the top of like, it's going to matter and we're going to remember it. And some of the stuff is inevitably going to sort to the bottom. That's just how the world works. By definition, some stuff has to just kind of like pass by the wayside. So my question to you, and Kellie, you can start here, but it's like, from these first 100 days, which do you think are going to really be remembered and really continue to have an impact in, 100 years?
Oh, man. I'm a little biased. Part of me wants to say academia, but that's because I'm an academic. Yeah. But I realize that does actually not impact the majority of Americans like I think it does. I think my second would be to think about the tariffs. I think when you start in a capitalist society, when you mess with people's coin, when small businesses and medium-sized businesses and even large businesses start to lose their wealth and their profits, and people start to see the price of things jack up significantly in ways that they've never seen before, I think that will have a huge lasting impact. And people will talk about, do you remember when such and such cost this much? Like, I think that will be something people will come back to.
I have two things that I think about. One is as we've talked about, the destruction of state capacity, particularly when it comes to things like scientific research, or even something like the ability to predict what the weather is going to be. The reason that I think that's sticking around is because you can destroy all of that in 100 days. But rebuilding it is a multi-generational project. Yeah. So either 100 years from now, we'll have rebuilt it, and that will have been the story of the 21st century, or we won't have rebuilt it. And the story will be, remember what the U.S. used to be able to do, what the federal government used to be able to do for its people. And kind of relatedly, like, I really take Kellie's point about the rest of the world. The United States got a mulligan for the first Trump administration from the rest of the world. They were like, that was a fluke. You're fucked up, but you pulled it back. And now they're like, oh, I get it. Like, the United States is not a reliable ally. It is not a reliable partner. It is in many ways now, if not an enemy, then certainly a competitor or a foe in a way that we have to work around. And so we have to build new alliances. And maybe we look towards China if the U.S. had been providing certain things like vaccines and development funds. Maybe we build new alliances that cut the U.S. out. The Five Eyes become Four Eyes. The NATO becomes something else. And that reordering of the global order is going to be something we're dealing with 100 years from now.
Yeah. I think that's where I come into, look, the damage to state capacity, the reordering of the executive power, all those things will have big lasting impact. But I will also say, and I think it's important for, people who believe in democracy, progressives, whatever you want to call it, to realize that there are moments, and they're happening more and more, where the Donald Trump administration is blinking and getting knocked down and, kind of in a game of chicken, and they are the first ones to duck. And so, again, I don't know if that means there won't be damage, but I do wonder if 100 years from now, or 10 months from now, we'll be like, man, they tried a lot of bullshit. And, you don't hear about that much anymore. I don't hear too much about trying to take the history books off the shelves or whatever. Like, it just
I need you to be right, Jody.
I know.
I need you to
From
be
your
right.
lips to God's ears, man.
No, I know. And I know some of this is motivated reasoning. I know. But I also do think there need to be moments where you kind of really see what's happening here. This reordering of the kind of global order, I almost kind of think that's baked in. I mean, I think the U.S., the American century or whatever is over. And it was probably going to end anyway, but Trump just kind of like accelerated it.
More of a crash landing than a soft landing.
Exactly. And, but I was talking to someone yesterday about during the first administration, there was, or when Trump was running for the first time, the phrase like, it can happen here, right? People talked about that a lot. It can happen here. And I think people often referred to that as like, it can happen here, like Nazi Germany, a dictator can rise to power, authoritarianism. And I think that's true. And I think that's still in the spectrum of things that could happen. But I always heard it can happen here through a slightly different lens, which was more like, what can happen here is that this country can just kind of turn into what politics and what leadership is in a lot of other countries, which is just kind of like a bunch of fucking corrupt jokers running around, only looking out for themselves. What can happen here is that we could just be another country, just another country. We're not the United States. We're not the gatekeepers of the world. We're not the one. We're not the beacon that everyone looks to, as problematic as that's been. What can happen here is we're just like, our politics is as broken as most of the countries in the world.
Corruption
we're no
is
longer
everywhere.
exceptional, And so that I think is kind of, I think that Rubicon is kind of passed. And so I think that will be the big lasting one.
Yeah, I think I agree.
Yeah. All right. Well, on that fun note,
you brought us up and then you took us back down.
Sorry.
I know, right?
But one actually totally unrelated, but we should give a shout out. Kelly, you were on It's Been a Minute.
Oh yes, I was talking
you
about
really like to talk about.
Talking about Oprah, and all of her Dr. Oz and Dr. Phil cronies, and it was really fun, and with Marsha Chetland, who's also been a guest on our show, so it was a lot of fun. Check it out if you can. Go
check that out. Nikki, anything you want to
Nothing new. I'm just semester's over and I'm on leave, so peace out. Suck out.
All right, go enjoy your brunch. I continue to do my little music show on the side, which is very fun and a welcome escape. So go listen to summer album, winter album. And I guess that's the hopeful note. As crazy as these 100 days have been, there are many more days ahead of us, and you have to find a way to keep on keeping on. So
yes,
do that.
Seek joy.
All right, thanks everyone. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
And thanks to everyone who's been watching and listening, and we'll see you soon.